Good music has a way of getting around. If it's traditional music, that means crossing lines between countries and categories, and that will be very much the case in the Rockport Celtic Festival, August 23rd through 25th. To tell us about the event is one of the masterminds, the host of A Celtic Sojourn on WGBH Radio, Brian O'Donovan. Thank you very much for being with us, Brian.
Great to be with you, Chris. Great to be back here.
Brian, you have dealt with a tradition that goes all the way, from pubs and church halls to conservatories almost. But where does this festival fit in that spectrum?
It kind of crosses what you just described, really. Celtic music is very much a vital and vibrant. You hear me saying that regularly. It's not an archival or a kind of a dusty drawer dweller at all. It's really a living, breathing thing. And what this festival does is really explores that in very, very artistic ways. It's a real privilege for us to be able to do it and to be able to celebrate and literally explore with an audience the crossover possibilities and the collaborative possibilities between Celtic music at its roots with its cousins like Appalachian music, classical music, some jazz and some contemporary folk.
Start with the setting here, because this is a nice hall right on the water in Rockport.
It's absolutely gorgeous. It was developed by an organization called Rockport Music, which is a not-for-profit that was founded probably in the early 80s. Bunch of North Shore people, Cape Ann folks said, let's do a chamber music festival, classical chamber festival. And they did that for a number of years, but they found that they were running out of venues. They would play in churches, they would play in libraries, in stores, wherever they could find spaces to platform their chamber music festival. And then they decided that they needed their own facility. And luckily they got huge amounts of support from the community and from one particular corporate funder, Shalin Liu, and they developed this venue that is probably one of the more prized venues in New England, in the whole Northeast. It's a small, intimate, 350, 60 seats, but as you said, sitting right on the water with an architectural feature that has an open glass window as the back of the stage looking onto the harbour itself.
And we're going to bring up a sort of a foretaste of this with the artistic director, Maeve Gilchrist, being involved. Brian, and people will see the harp and say right away, well, that looks pretty Celtic, but what's the cello doing there?
It's an interesting combination. Maeve Gilchrist, who is our artistic director, in addition to being this great instrumentalist, is, as you point out, a harpist. And the harp, there's no more of a Celtic instrument. It's literally the emblem of Ireland, along with the shamrock. But it has been loosed from any sort of boundaries that it might have had back in the early days. It is now a very contemporary instrument being used across all sorts of genres of music, especially the contemporary end of Celtic music, which you just heard her playing there with Natalie Haas. Natalie Haas is a Juilliard-educated classical cellist who has chosen Celtic music as her genre of music, and she is taking the cello into new heights, playing melody, as you heard there, not just accompaniment. So lots of exciting things happening amongst that youth movement in Celtic music, including the use of instruments, especially in combinations that might have been hitherto somewhat unusual.
Well, you also have the history of jigs written by Bach, so there's Celtic tradition there too. You have another group that also crosses into the classical category pretty deeply.
We do, certainly. We've got Palaver Strings, for one, which is a 13-piece chamber orchestra. And they've been designed as a musician-led group. There's a group here in Boston called a Far Cry, which describe themselves as conductor-less group. In other words, there's no actual central figure. These musicians get together and play for the sheer joy of it, almost like a session of traditional music would be in a pub in Ireland or Edinburgh. So this Palaver kind of follows that principle, and we're looking forward to combining with them for some collaborative work, some new work that has been newly written by musicians participating in the festival.
Another crossover group is called Rakish.
Rakish is, yes, a good example of another group. Maura Sean Scanlon, a young fiddler, violin player, if she was describing herself as a classical musician, and she basically takes some early music and is able to blend it very seamlessly into what is obviously traditional Irish music, and she's joined by a young guitarist called Conor Hearn.
And you have the Seamus Egan project here too?
The Seamus Egan project, again, delving into very sophisticated ends of Celtic influenced music. Seamus Egan is our music director for our big extravaganza at Christmas called the Christmas Celtic Sojourn. But he is at heart a traditional musician with always an eye towards the contemporary. And he has teamed up now with Moira Smiley, who's a very innovative singer, Owen Marshall, who's an amazing bouzouki player, and one Kyle Sana, who is known for his compositions in new classical music in New York City.
I know you have at least one exponent of the sort of Appalachian bluegrass offshoot. Tell us about that.
Very, very exciting to have Bruce Molsky, who is regarded as one of the top exponents of traditional Appalachian fiddling and singing. He's got a great singing voice as well. And he is joined by Alison de Groot, who is now a Boston resident, though not always so. And it plays the Appalachian banjo in a clawhammer style that is very, very distinctive and very Appalachian.
Brian, the musicians certainly have a lot of practice in crossing boundaries, but how do you help the audience do that, the way you line things up in this festival?
That's a really interesting question. You know, I regard myself as being in the unbelievably privileged position of being a curator of this type of music. And as such, I take that responsibility very seriously, much like a curator would for an exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts, not far from here. That it's their responsibility to invite people into what they're looking to present. So a little bit of background, a little bit of context, and not assuming a high level of knowledge without talking down to the audience. So I'm very conscious of that as a host. I'm very active on stage, and I think like the audience. I represent the audience in presenting the context of the musical pieces, perhaps their place in history, in styles, and what we're trying to achieve in, say, collaborative work or new work that might be written. So I wanted to make it informal, accessible, almost salon-like, as opposed to just an entertainment event.
You mentioned this is August 23rd through 25th, so if people want tickets and more details about times, where should they get that?
They should just go basically either to wgbh.org/Celtic, or these days a simple search of Rockport Celtic music or Rockport Celtic Festival will pop right to the site, and there's lots of information including what events are there. Some of them are already sold out, so really it's important to get tickets in advance. We also have sessions involved. They're not just all concerts. We actually retreat upstairs each night for informal sessions, and they're ticketed events as well. They're just like $10 or something, but it's a way for people to gather, have a beer, glass of wine, meet like-minded people, and relax around the musicians.
From the concert hall back to the pub. Thank you very much for being with us.
Great to be with you, Chris. Thank you for the time.
Brian O'Donovan. We'll have more news in just a moment.